January 6th, 1944. 8th Air Force Headquarters, England. Major General Jimmy Doolittle walked into a briefing room packed with fighter pilots and bomber commanders. The tension was suffocating. These men had been arguing for hours about escort tactics, about losses, about the nightmare over Germany. Doolittle raised his hand. Silence. "Gentlemen, effective immediately, your fighters will stop escorting bombers." The room erupted. Bomber commanders shot to their feet. Fighter pilots exchanged confused glances. One colonel shouted over the chaos, "Sir, that's suicide." Doolittle's voice cut through the noise like steel. "No, what we've been doing is suicide. This will win the war." This order, called reckless by commanders, called abandonment by bomber crews, called a death sentence by the men who'd fly it, would destroy the Luftwaffe in 16 weeks. But first, it would kill thousands. To understand why Doolittle made this insane decision, you need to understand the crisis that brought him to England. And that crisis had a name. Black Thursday, October 14th, 1943. Mission 115 to Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany. The target was critical. Ball-bearing plants that produced components essential for every tank, every aircraft, every weapon the Germans built. Destroy these factories, the thinking went, and you cripple the entire Nazi war machine. 291 B-17 flying fortresses took off that morning. The crews knew this one would be bad. Schweinfurt was 400 miles inside Germany. Their P-47 Thunderbolt escorts could only fly with them for the first 200 miles before fuel forced them to turn back. After that, the bombers would be alone for 4 hours. Completely alone. At the German border, the American fighters waggled their wings, the signal for "good luck, you're on your own," and peeled away. The bomber crews watched their only protection disappear toward England. Then they flew on into hell. The German fighters had been waiting. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, over 300 of them, formed up in massive waves beyond visual range. Then they attacked. Head-on passes through the bomber formations at closing speeds over 600 miles per hour. Some German fighters carried 30mm cannons. A single hit could tear a B-17 in half. Others fired air-to-air rockets from beyond machine gun range. The American gunners fired desperately, but seconds later the German fighters were already through the formation, looping back for another pass. For 2 hours, the slaughter continued. Lieutenant James McClure flew tail-end Charlie that day, the last bomber in the formation, the most exposed position. His diary entry from that night is preserved at the Air Force Museum. "I watched 11 fortresses go down in 90 minutes. Some exploded. Some spiraled down trailing fire. Some just fell apart. I counted 73 parachutes. That means 37 men died before they could jump. We dropped our bombs and turned for home. The fighters followed us all the way to the border. Every minute felt like an hour. Every second I waited for the cannon shell with my name on it." McClure survived. 600 other men did not. 60 bombers failed to return to England that afternoon. Another 17 were damaged beyond repair. Total write-offs. 77 B-17s destroyed in a single mission. At $4 million per aircraft, adjusted for inflation, that's over $4 billion in losses, in one day. But the aircraft could be replaced. The men could not. The mathematics were brutal and simple. American bomber crews were required to fly 25 missions before they could go home. At the loss rates from October 1943, the statistical probability of surviving 25 missions was between 25 and 35%. In other words, if you were assigned to a bomber crew, you had a 2/3 chance of dying before completing your tour. This wasn't war. This was industrial-scale execution. The defensive doctrine simply wasn't working. Under the current tactics, fighters flew close escort, staying within visual range of the bomber formations, reacting when German fighters attacked. The theory seemed logical. Keep the fighters near the bombers, and they can drive off attackers before the bombers suffer casualties. But theory and reality were diverging catastrophically. The Germans had developed tactics that exploited the defensive posture perfectly. They would form up 20 or 30 miles away, beyond where American escorts could see them. Then they'd coordinate their attack, multiple waves hitting the bomber stream simultaneously from different angles. By the time American fighters reacted and intercepted, the Germans had already torn through the formations, destroyed multiple bombers, and were diving away at full speed. The American fighters would pursue briefly, maybe shoot down one or two attackers, but then doctrine required them to return immediately to the bombers. They could never press the attack, never finish off wounded German fighters, never disrupt the enemy before the next wave attacked. The Americans were playing defense. The Germans controlled the tempo, the timing, the location of every engagement. And in air combat, whoever has the initiative survives. Whoever reacts dies. The losses were unsustainable. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding all United States Army Air Forces, made this brutally clear in a December 1943 meeting with his top commanders. Arnold didn't mince words. Unless the German Air Force is destroyed, Operation Overlord cannot proceed. We cannot invade France with the Luftwaffe intact. They'll slaughter the invasion forces on the beaches. And at current loss rates, the 8th Air Force will cease to exist as an effective fighting force within 6 months. Find a solution, or we cancel the strategic bombing campaign entirely. The stakes couldn't be higher. Without air superiority, there would be no invasion. Without an invasion, the war in Europe would drag on for years. Millions more would die. And right now, in December 1943, the Luftwaffe was winning the air war, winning decisively. Back in England, bomber crews calculated their odds every day. They'd pin photos of their crew on their barrack walls. After each mission, they'd note who made it back. The photos of the lost crews stayed up, a growing memorial to friends who'd never return. Some barracks had more photos of dead men than living ones. One B-17 co-pilot wrote in his diary, "We're not fighting a war. We're serving execution sentences in the sky. Every morning they wake us at 0400, give us breakfast, and lead us to our bombers. We take off knowing there's a 1 in 5 chance we won't land again. The Germans are good. Their fighters are good. Our tactics guarantee they have every advantage. We need something to change, or we're all going to die." Something did change, but the solution that arrived in November 1943 wasn't what anyone expected. It came in the form of a sleek silver fighter with a distinctive scoop under its belly and an attitude problem. The North American P-51 Mustang. And more importantly, it came with a general who understood a fundamental truth about air combat that everyone else had forgotten. Fighters are offensive weapons. Using them defensively is not just ineffective, it's suicide. The weapon had arrived. The general had arrived. Now came the controversial part, convincing everyone that the way to save the bombers was to stop protecting them. The P-51 Mustang shouldn't have existed. It was born from desperation, bureaucratic chaos, and a lucky accident that changed the war. In 1940, the British needed fighters desperately. The Hurricane and Spitfire were excellent, but British factories couldn't produce them fast enough. So the Royal Air Force approached North American aviation in California with an unusual request: design and build a completely new fighter in 120 days. North Americans' engineers worked around the clock. They created a sleek aerodynamic airframe with laminar flow wings, a design that reduced drag dramatically. They fitted it with an American Allison engine. The result was fast and handled beautifully. But at high altitude, where bomber escorts needed to fight, the Allison engine gasped for air. Performance collapsed above 15,000 feet. The Mustang was useless as an escort fighter. Then someone had an idea. What if they replaced the Allison with a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same engine that powered the Spitfire? Packard was already building Merlins under license in America. The Merlin had a two-stage supercharger that thrived at altitude. They tried it. The results shocked everyone. The new P-51B with the Packard Merlin engine was a revelation. It cruised at 437 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter. At 30,000 feet, where Messerschmitt struggled, the Mustang was just getting started. It could reach 41,000 feet and fight effectively at altitudes where German pilots could barely keep their aircraft controllable. But the real game changer was range. With drop tanks, external fuel tanks that could be jettisoned when empty, the P-51 could fly 1,600 miles. Round trip. That meant Berlin and back. That meant anywhere in Germany and back. For the first time, American fighters could escort bombers to any target in the Third Reich. Captain Chuck Yeager, flying P-51s with the 357 fighter group, wrote in his combat report after his first mission in the type, "This aircraft changes everything. It's faster than the 109, turns tighter than the 190, and has legs to go anywhere the bombers go. We finally have the tool we need. Now we just need permission to use it properly." That last sentence was the problem. Having the range to escort bombers all the way to target was revolutionary. But most commanders still thought defensively. Their plan was simple. Now that we have fighters that can go the distance, we'll just keep doing what we've been doing, close escort tactics, but for the entire mission instead of just the first half. Same failed doctrine, just applied for longer. Jimmy Doolittle saw it differently. Doolittle wasn't a typical general. He was a fighter pilot, a racing champion, a test pilot who'd pushed aircraft to their absolute limits, and he held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He understood aircraft performance at a level most generals couldn't approach. He'd won the Medal of Honor for personally leading the Tokyo raid in 1942, a mission so audacious, so technically complex, that most experts said it was impossible. Doolittle had a talent for seeing solutions that others missed. And when he looked at the air war over Germany in January 1944, he saw the problem clearly. American fighters were being wasted. They were offensive weapons being used defensively. They were wolves being forced to act like sheepdogs. And it was killing bomber crews and fighter pilots alike. The mathematics of air combat were simple to Doolittle. Every German fighter in the air was a threat to bombers. Therefore, the most effective way to protect bombers was to destroy German fighters before they could attack. Not after. Before. And the best way to destroy German fighters was to hunt them aggressively, to go where they formed up, to intercept them before they reached the bombers, and to chase them relentlessly when they tried to escape. Offensive action, pure and simple. On January 6, 1944, his first full day in command of 8th Air Force, Doolittle issued his revolutionary order. Fighters would no longer fly close escort, staying within visual range of bombers. Instead, they would range ahead of the bomber stream, up to 50 miles forward and 25 miles to either side, actively hunting German fighters wherever they could be found. After bombers dropped their payloads and turned for home, American fighters would not return with them. Instead, they would sweep across Germany at low altitude, strafing airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground, attacking trains, fuel depots, and anything else that supported the Luftwaffe. The goal was total, not protection, destruction, the complete annihilation of the Luftwaffe as a fighting force. And one more thing. Doolittle walked into Major General William Kepner's office, commander of 8th Fighter Command, and pointed to the sign above his desk. It read, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." "That sign is wrong," Doolittle said quietly. "Take it down." By the end of the day, a new sign hung in its place. "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." The reaction was immediate and divided. Fighter pilots, especially the veterans, understood immediately. Colonel Don Blakesley, commander of the legendary 4th Fighter Group, gathered his pilots that evening and told them, "This is what we've been asking for. Freedom to hunt. We're no longer shepherds guarding sheep. We're wolves, and starting tomorrow, we hunt." But bomber crews were terrified. They'd survived missions only because fighters stayed close, driving off attackers. Now those fighters would disappear over the horizon, leaving them apparently defenseless against the German fighter waves they'd come to dread. One bombardier wrote home, "Our new general has decided to let the fighters go play cowboy while we fly unprotected into Germany. The boys are calling it a death sentence. I'm scheduled for my 9th mission on Friday. I don't expect to make it to 10. The opposition went beyond bomber crews. Senior bomber commanders, men who'd built their careers on the current doctrine, called Doolittle's order reckless. Some privately lobbied General Karl Spaatz, Doolittle's superior, to countermand the directive. British Air Marshal Arthur Harris thought the Americans had lost their minds. "They're going to lose the air war in a fortnight," he told his staff. Even some fighter pilots had doubts. The veterans welcomed the freedom to hunt. But newer pilots understood the moral weight of what they were being asked to do. They'd be leaving their friends, the bomber crews they'd trained with, eaten with, shared barracks with, alone and apparently defenseless while they chased German fighters over the horizon. If the bombers got slaughtered while the fighters were gone, that blood would be on their hands. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a P-47 pilot with 27 kills who'd later transitioned to P-51s, captured the tension in his diary. Doolittle's order makes tactical sense. Killing Germans before they reach the bombers is better than killing them after they've already done damage. But try explaining that to a bomber crew. Try telling them you're going to fly 50 miles away while they go into the worst flak and fighter defences in Germany. They think we're abandoning them. Maybe we are. Or maybe we're protecting them better than they understand. Doolittle held firm. In a meeting with his top commanders, he laid out his reasoning with brutal clarity. The best way to protect a bomber is to destroy the enemy fighter before it takes off. We will win this war by killing, not by defending. Offensive action wins air battles. Defensive action loses them. I don't care if the bomber crews like it. I don't care if you like it. This is how we win." He paused, looking each man in the eye. "Our mission is to destroy the Luftwaffe completely. Not tomorrow, not next month, now. Any questions?" There were none. On January 11th, 1944, just 5 days after the order, the new tactics would be tested in combat. The results would shock everyone, and the German fighter force would begin bleeding to death. January 11th, 1944, the first mission under the new doctrine. The bomber crews watched with growing dread as their P-51 escorts accelerated ahead of the formation and disappeared over the horizon. For men who'd survived missions only because fighters stayed close, this felt like abandonment. Radio chatter in the bomber formations reflected the anxiety. Where are they going? They're leaving us. We're alone. But 50 miles ahead, the American fighters were doing something revolutionary. They were hunting. Major James Howard, flying alone after his squadrons scattered in cloud cover, spotted a formation of 30 German fighters assembling for an attack run on the bombers. The Germans were coordinating their approach, positioning themselves for the devastating head-on passes that had killed so many Americans over Schweinfurt. Howard didn't hesitate. Alone, outnumbered 30-1, he dove into the German formation and shattered their attack before it began. For the next 30 minutes, he engaged the enemy alone, shooting down multiple aircraft, damaging others, and disrupting the German coordination so completely that they never mounted their planned attack. By the time other American fighters arrived, the German formation had scattered. The bombers continued to target unmolested. Howard would receive the Medal of Honor for that mission. But more importantly, he'd proven Doolittle's theory. Intercepting German fighters before they reached the bombers was devastatingly effective. The bomber crews who'd feared abandonment completed their mission with minimal losses. By the time they landed back in England, the radio networks were buzzing with the results. 15 German fighters destroyed, only 3 bombers lost. One mission proved the concept, but one mission wasn't enough to win a war. What came next would change everything. February 20th through 25th, 1944. Big week. This was the plan. 6 consecutive days of maximum effort. The 8th Air Force would launch every available bomber and fighter against German aircraft factories and the Luftwaffe itself. The goal wasn't just to damage German production, it was to force the Luftwaffe to defend and then destroy them when they rose to fight. 3,800 bomber sorties, 3,673 fighter sorties, the largest concentrated air offensive in history to that point. Lieutenant Clarence Bud Anderson flew P-51s with the 357th Fighter Group throughout Big Week. His experience tells the story of how Doolittle's tactics shattered the Luftwaffe. Day 1, February 20th. Anderson's squadron ranged 40 miles ahead of the bomber stream, hunting for German fighters forming up to attack. They found them, a group of Messerschmitt 109s climbing to intercept altitude. Anderson dove into the formation. The Germans scattered. In the chaos, Anderson destroyed 2 Bf-19s before they could threaten a single bomber. His combat report noted, intercepted enemy fighters 35 miles from bomber stream. Destroyed 2 aircraft. Bombers proceeded to target without enemy contact. That sentence, without enemy contact, was the revolution. Under the old doctrine, those bombers would have faced those fighters in a brutal head-on attack. Under Doolittle's doctrine, the threat was eliminated before it materialized. Day 3, February 22nd. This was when the strafing campaign began in earnest. After escorting bombers to target and engaging German fighters in the air, Anderson's squadron descended to low altitude and swept across the German countryside looking for targets of opportunity. They found a Luftwaffe airfield near Leipzig. Anderson's wingman later described what happened. We came in at 50 feet, full throttle. German aircraft were parked in neat rows, sitting ducks. Bud destroyed 4 planes on the ground in a single strafing pass. I got 3. But the flak was murderous. We lost 2 pilots on that one airfield attack. The Germans were waiting for us. This was the hidden cost of Doolittle's aggressive doctrine. Strafing attacks were extraordinarily dangerous. German airfields bristled with anti-aircraft guns. Pilots had to fly straight and level at extremely low altitude, making themselves perfect targets to effectively strafe-parked aircraft. The loss rates for strafing missions were brutal, but the results were undeniable. By the end of Big Week, American fighters had destroyed more German aircraft on the ground than in the air. Luftwaffe fighters that survived aerial combat would land, refuel and rearm, only to be destroyed by American fighters sweeping the airfields at treetop level. There was no sanctuary, no safety, nowhere to hide. Day 6, February 25th. Anderson's squadron claimed 17 aerial victories in a single mission. The German pilots they faced were increasingly desperate, their tactics increasingly reckless. "They came at us head-on," Anderson wrote in his diary. "No maneuvers, no tactics, just straight charges. Some of them were good, veterans who knew what they were doing, but others flew like students, green pilots who barely knew how to dogfight. We shot them down like ducks in a shooting gallery, and it felt terrible even as we did it." Big Week ended with staggering statistics. 692 German aircraft destroyed. Confirmed kills, not estimates. 20% of the Luftwaffe's single-engine fighter force wiped out in 6 days. German aircraft production facilities devastated. American bombers had reached their targets with unprecedented success, but the American cost was severe. 137 bombers lost. 28 fighters lost. Over 1,000 American airmen dead or captured in a single week. The butcher's bill was high, yet the loss rates were lower than they'd been under defensive tactics, and the strategic results were incomparably better. More importantly, Big Week had broken something fundamental in the Luftwaffe. The aggressive American tactics had created a death spiral that German commanders couldn't escape. Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, recognized the crisis immediately. In a February 1944 report to Hermann Göring, he wrote with unusual bluntness, "We are bleeding to death. The Americans have changed their tactics. Their fighters no longer stay with the bombers. They hunt us everywhere, in the air, on the ground, even when we taxi for takeoff. We cannot replace our losses fast enough. We cannot train new pilots fast enough. And now we face a new problem. Fuel shortages mean the new pilots we do train receive minimal flight time before being sent into combat. They die on their first or second mission. The mathematics were brutal." In January 1944, the average German fighter pilot had over 200 hours of combat experience. These were veterans, skilled, dangerous opponents who could hold their own against American pilots. By April 1944, just 2 months after Big Week, the average had fallen to 75 combat hours. By June, it was below 50 hours. The death spiral worked like this. Aggressive American tactics killed experienced German pilots faster than they could be replaced. Inexperienced pilots sent up to fill the gaps died even faster. They simply lacked the skills to survive against veteran American pilots flying superior aircraft. This created more gaps, requiring even less experienced pilots to be sent into combat with even less training. Loss rates accelerated. Pilot quality collapsed. In April 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 43% of its fighter pilots in a single month. One German pilot's diary entry from that period survives. "We are not fighting a war anymore. We are attending our own funeral. Every morning we get the list of who died yesterday. Every evening we wonder if we'll be on tomorrow's list. The Americans are everywhere. They own the sky. The numbers tell the story." In 1943, Luftwaffe fighters had achieved a kill ratio of 1.2 to 1. They shot down slightly more American aircraft than they lost. In early 1944, the ratio reversed to 3.7 to 1 in favor of American fighters. By late 1944, it exceeded 7 to 1. The Luftwaffe wasn't just losing, it was being systematically exterminated. And then came June 6th, 1944, D-Day, the ultimate validation of Doolittle's strategy. 11,000 Allied aircraft supported the Normandy invasion. They flew 14,000 sorties on D-Day alone. The Luftwaffe, the air force that had terrorized Europe since 1939, that had bombed London, that had destroyed the Polish and French air forces, flew fewer than 100 sorties. General Dwight Eisenhower told his troops before the invasion, "If you see aircraft above you, they will be ours." He was right. The sky over Normandy was empty of German aircraft. not because the Luftwaffe lacked planes, not because they lacked fuel, though both were increasingly scarce. The sky was empty because 5 months earlier, Jimmy Doolittle had changed fighter tactics, and those tactics had killed the Luftwaffe. The numbers tell part of the story. Between January and June 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 2,262 fighter pilots killed in action. Thousands more were wounded or captured. German aircraft production actually increased during this period. Factories were producing fighters faster than ever. But it didn't matter. Germany had run out of trained pilots capable of flying them effectively. The Americans lost heavily too. Over 26,000 American airmen died in the skies over Europe during World War II. That's more fatalities than the entire United States Marine Corps suffered in the Pacific Theater. The 8th Air Force alone suffered over 47,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. These weren't abstract statistics. They were sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. They were 19-year-old kids from Iowa and Texas and New York who climbed into aircraft every morning knowing they might not see another sunset. Lieutenant William R. Lawley's story captures the human cost. On February 20th, 1944, the first day of Big Week, Lawley piloted a B-17 over Leipzig when German fighters attacked. A 20mm cannon shell exploded in the cockpit, killing the co-pilot instantly and severely wounding Lawley in the face and body. The aircraft's controls were damaged. The bombardier was dead. 8 of the 10 crew members were wounded. Lawley, bleeding heavily and barely able to see, kept the crippled bomber flying for over 2 hours, gave the order for his crew to bail out over friendly territory, then, despite being urged to jump himself, stayed with the aircraft and crash-landed it to save the 3 crew members too wounded to parachute. He survived. He received the Medal of Honor. But the co-pilot, the bombardier, and 2 gunners did not come home. Stories like Lawley's played out hundreds of times during those crucial months. The bomber crews bought air superiority with their blood. But here's the hard truth that Doolittle understood. They would have died in even greater numbers under the old defensive tactics. The aggressive fighter doctrine, the doctrine that bomber crews initially feared and opposed, actually saved their lives. The evidence came from the statistics. In October 1943, under defensive fighter tactics, bomber loss rates reached 10 to 15% per mission. By April 1944, under Doolittle's offensive tactics, loss rates had fallen to 2 to 3% per mission. The percentage of crews completing their required 25 mission tour increased from 25% to over 50%. Bomber crews were twice as likely to survive and go home. The paradox had proven true. The best way to protect bombers was to stop protecting them defensively and start hunting their attackers aggressively. For the German pilots, the campaign was simply catastrophic. These were not faceless enemies. They were brave men fighting for a nation led by monsters, and most of them knew it. By 1944, many German fighter pilots understood they were defending an indefensible regime. But they kept flying because their homes were being bombed, their families were in danger, and surrender meant their nation's complete destruction. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, a Luftwaffe fighter ace, wrote in his diary in April 1944, "We climb into our fighters knowing we will not return. Not today, perhaps, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. The mathematics are inescapable. We are outnumbered 5 to 1. Our aircraft are inferior. Our new pilots have 30 hours of training while the Americans have 400. We fight with courage and skill, but courage cannot overcome such odds. One by one, my friends die. Soon it will be my turn." Knoke survived the war, but most of his squadron did not. By May 1944, the average life expectancy of a new German fighter pilot was less than 2 weeks. Teenagers with minimal training were being thrown into combat against veteran American pilots flying superior aircraft with overwhelming numerical advantage. It was slaughter, and both sides knew it. Major Erich Hartmann, the war's highest-scoring ace with 352 victories, fought primarily on the Eastern Front. After the war, he reflected on what happened in the West. The Americans destroyed the Luftwaffe over Germany in 1944. They had better aircraft, better trained pilots, and superior tactics. We fought bravely, but we were overwhelmed. General Doolittle's strategy was brilliant. It cost us everything. There was no defense against it. Back in England, something remarkable happened. The bomber crews who had opposed Doolittle's tactics, who had written in diaries about being abandoned, who had called the new doctrine suicide, began to change their minds. The evidence was undeniable. They were coming home more often. Their friends were surviving. The German fighter attacks that had been so devastating were becoming less frequent, less coordinated, less effective. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of the Memphis Belle, had written bitterly in his diary in January 1944, "The fighters are leaving us. Doolittle says this will protect us better, but how can abandonment be protection?" By May 1944, after completing several missions under the new tactics, Morgan wrote a very different entry. "I was wrong. The fighters are protecting us, just not the way we expected. They're killing the Germans before the Germans can reach us. I haven't seen a coordinated German fighter attack in 3 missions. The sky feels different. We're actually going to survive this." Post-war interviews with bomber veterans revealed a near-universal acknowledgement. Carl Moore, a B-17 tailgunner, said in a 1990 interview, "We thought Doolittle was crazy. We thought he was going to get us all killed, but he saved our lives. The Germans couldn't attack us effectively because American fighters were slaughtering them before they could form up. We were safer being abandoned by aggressive hunters than we'd ever been with defensive escorts staying close." The tactical revolution had proven itself not just strategically, but operationally. Air forces around the world studied what happened over Germany in 1944 and learned fundamental lessons that still govern air combat doctrine today. Offensive action defeats defensive action when capabilities are roughly equal. The side that seizes initiative and attacks aggressively forces the enemy to react. The side that reacts is always one step behind, always at a disadvantage. Air superiority comes from destroying enemy aircraft, not from protecting friendly aircraft. This seems obvious in retrospect, but in 1944 it was revolutionary. The goal of fighter aviation is not defense, it's annihilation of enemy air power. Superior training produces exponentially superior results. The kill ratio differences between 1943 and 1944 weren't primarily about better aircraft. The P-51 was excellent, but the P-47 was also capable. The difference was pilot quality. American pilots averaged 400-plus hours of flight time before combat. German pilots by mid-1944 averaged 50 hours. That gap was insurmountable. The doctrine that emerged from Doolittle's January 1944 order became foundational to modern air warfare. When the United States established air superiority in the 1991 Gulf War, the tactics were the same: aggressive fighter sweeps, hunting enemy aircraft wherever they could be found, attacking airfields, and destroying aircraft on the ground. When Israel achieved air supremacy in the 1967 Six-Day War, they used the same principles: offense, not defense; initiative, not reaction; destruction, not protection. The original sign that hung in General Kepner's office, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive," now resides in the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Next to it hangs the replacement sign that Doolittle ordered, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." Together, those two signs tell the story of a revolution in military thinking. They represent the moment when conventional wisdom was challenged and proven wrong, when the insane strategy turned out to be the only sane approach. Jimmy Doolittle retired from the Air Force in 1946 with the rank of Lieutenant General. He received the Medal of Honor, multiple Distinguished Service Medals, and honorary knighthood from Britain. But in a 1973 interview, when asked about his greatest achievement, he didn't mention the Tokyo raid. He mentioned the fighter directive. "Changing the fighter tactics was the hardest decision I made in the war," Doolittle said. "Bomber commanders opposed it. Bomber crews feared it. Some fighter pilots thought it was suicide. But I knew from my own experience as a fighter pilot that offensive action wins air battles. You cannot win by defending. You win by attacking." He paused, and his voice became quieter. "The losses were terrible. Every loss haunted me, but they would have been worse, far worse, under defensive tactics. We won because we accepted risk and attacked aggressively. Sometimes the hardest choice is the right choice."